Chris Wysopal is co-founder and chief technology officer at Veracode, the company that pioneered the concept of automated static binary analysis to discover vulnerabilities in software. Chris was one of the original vulnerability researchers at The Loft, a hacker think tank where he was one of the first to publicize the risks of insecure software. He has testified to the U.S. Congress on the subjects of government security and how vulnerabilities are discovered in software. He brought his unique appreciation for software vulnerability and the corresponding appreciation for supply chain management of mission-critical software especially to Veracode. From concept to its current business portfolio, Veracode was built with one overriding characteristic: made in the USA. Chris Wysopal is recognized globally as a pioneer in software development supply chain, and he is a high-demand speaker on this subject in the United States and abroad. He has testified before Congress on this subject. Made in the USA, Trusted Sourcing, EDGE22 is pleased to welcome Veracode CTO and founder, Chris Wysopal.
Chris, thank you. I'm going to just say a couple words. Thank you, Chris. I just wanted to say something. Neil Bird is here, was formerly a GBF member with Exxon and now with Veracode, and approached us as we were, and I do want to, Ed, that was very sobering, and again, we're going to have our co-chairs join us at the end, but did so much to help put this program together. And as we were following on Ed, if you think about the program that you've seen over the last few days, it was by design. We have the congressional view, enforcement, prosecution, state of law, and then case studies of security, panel discussions. Today supply chain was talked about a lot yesterday, but that's what we are talking about today. And to have a company, I think in 2006 when you were formed, I don't mean to take from your presentation, understood then what the challenges that we all appreciate now. And so it's a real pleasure to have you here, Chris, and thanks.
Thank you, Don. It's my first GBEF summit, so it's nice to be invited here, and I thank you for that. So as you saw in the intro, I started off as a vulnerability researcher back in the late 90s, and that's why I was called before Congress to testify, because it was the first government hearing on government computer security, and it was quite an interesting hearing because on the Senate side you had people larger than life figures like Fred Thompson and John Glenn. And John Glenn actually knows a bit about technology, so he was an interesting person to have questioning us. But what we wanted to get across at that point in time was that sort of the default state of software is it has vulnerabilities in it. Like your large software vendors will tell you that they don't have vulnerabilities in the software and they're trying to take care of that. But at the time, they just really weren't doing it. And our point was, if we can find these vulnerabilities as outsiders, as a bunch of 8 guys in a hacker think tank, then imagine what a nation state could do, really funding this. We had Richard Clark, who was working for the National Security Council, come visit us around that time, and he saw that we were doing this with hardware that we had just found in dumpsters or were cast-offs of the corporations that we worked at. It was sitting in the closet, and we asked it if we could take it home. And we built these networks where we could do this kind of vulnerability testing with basically no funding at all. And he said that really changed his threat model. He just saw that this was something that was really easy to do, and we all know this is a very asymmetrical problem to solve. So what I did was I got sick of poking the bear and pulling the pants down of large corporations just to make a point, and I said I need to do something about this. So I became a consultant, and I worked for companies like Microsoft and eBay and Fidelity, helping them build secure software. And then in 2006, I decided this needs to be a highly automated process. Like, we need to help these software vendors find the vulnerabilities in their process as they're building software. And that's why I founded Veracode is to really help make all the software built around the world more secure, so people could rely on it. And so we started off with those traditional customers like financial services, large manufacturers, and it was kind of interesting. No software vendors as customers. So banks make a lot of software, manufacturing companies make a lot of software. They also buy a huge amount of software. And what I quickly learned was the only way to get software vendors to care about security was to have their customers care about security. And so we would go. So some of our biggest customers, one of them was Boeing at the time, came to us and said, you know what? Can I force some of my small vendors that I don't have any idea what their process is for building their software, how much insecurity it's bringing into my network, into my systems, can I force them to go to Veracode to get tested and have Veracode make sure that they meet my policy, my criteria, essentially make sure they're building software as secure as the software I'm building for myself. And that's where we started to think about this as really a supply chain problem. Sure, we wanted to go directly and help people build better software, but really the bigger market was getting customers of software vendors to care enough to have them force their vendors to do something. And then over time, over the last 10 years, more and more software vendors have kind of got on board with what the big enterprises were doing. But I thought it was pretty interesting that enterprises cared about the security of their own code, and then they started to care about the security of the vendor code that they were buying. So one of the things I learned was the default state of software is, you have software vendors create what we call first-party code. They also hire contractors to create that first-party code. But then the other thing is, and over time this has changed, is open source has become the majority of the code in any software you're buying. When I started Veracode back in 2006, we would see 10, maybe 20% of the average piece of software would be made up of open source. Some barely had any, and some had more, but it was like 10, 20%. It was a fraction. That was easier to manage. Today, we see 80 to 90% of the code in the average software package we look at is open source code. So open source has exploded and has become the majority of the code that's running when you build an application or purchase software. And that's obviously because the ecosystem has all this capabilities to share much more easily now. This has just really grown in the last 15 years. The other change that's made this happen is the newer languages like JavaScript, Node.js, Angular, Python. A lot of these new languages that are going into more cloud-based applications, they actually are designed to leverage a lot of open source. Like the language itself is like you have to build the app with 95% open source or you're not using Node.js. So the language's direction that developers are going in is just to use more and more open source. So what else is in the technology you purchase? That's the good stuff. The bad stuff is, of course, there's vulnerabilities in the first-party code that the developers are writing and the contractors, and also in the open source that are being written potentially even by the same developers, just it might be their hobby on the side. And that's just the default state of building software. We make mistakes when we build software. It's a very manual effort to build software. It's trying to get more and more automated. But sort of the default state of software is a developer didn't get educated in writing secure code in school. They may not have even gotten some training on the job. They're going to write insecure software. The open source teams are too. So you need to have processes built into that development process to check for it. Just like you have quality tests, you have performance tests. You're not going to get a high-performing piece of software unless you have performance tests and you get the output of that test and you feed it back in and you make improvements. Same thing with quality. Same thing with software vulnerabilities. You need to have that testing embedded in the process or you're not going to get secure output. The other thing about open source code is the way it's used oftentimes is the developer chooses an open source library to do a particular job, like create an SSL connection or log data to a log file, and they select it, and it may have no vulnerabilities that are known in that software when they select it, but 5, 6, 7 years later, they haven't changed that component. It's working. There's no reason to change it. But over that period of time, vulnerability researchers have inspected that software and will find new vulnerabilities. So we're constantly seeing, like the Log4j, that vulnerability had been in the software for 5 years, and then it was found. And then all the people who installed that software installed that component 5 years ago, now all of a sudden they're vulnerable. So, the way to think about open source is it has latent vulnerabilities. They'll be discovered at some time. It ages like milk, right? Eventually, that open source component you're using will need to be replaced. It will go bad over time. And those are just some of the understanding you have to have in order to build a process that can help eliminate those things. And then, of course, there's malicious code that potentially could be inserted. Obviously, the SolarWinds situation is famous. I have some examples of open source where malicious code has been inserted. We have 2,500 customers. We've scanned hundreds of thousands of applications. I'm here to tell you, finding inserted malicious code is extremely, extremely hard. It's basically we don't find it at all, and there's really two reasons for that. The best way that I think to insert malicious code is just to insert a vulnerability that you can exploit, right? Insert a vulnerability that's hard to find, that you can exploit, and then when Veracode finds it for our customer, we just found another vulnerability. We don't know the intent of who changed that code, whether they made a mistake or they put in a vulnerability on purpose. So I think that's a huge class of malicious code that's inserted is like that. And then the other one is just a sophisticated backdoor, looks almost exactly like the software is supposed to work. And that's what we saw in the SolarWinds case. Trying to detect that by inspection is extremely hard. And if it just looks like business logic, you have to really understand what the business logic was. And that's extremely hard to know. Especially as a third party, you really have to have the designers of the software inspect it themselves, and really no companies do that. It's just not practical. So I think for the sophisticated backdoors, it's really prevention. It's protecting that software development pipeline to protect it from being tampered. I think that's really the only way to do that. But for vulnerabilities, there are methods that we have: static analysis, dynamic analysis, interactive analysis for scanning for those vulnerabilities in the code. So I want to tell I almost have to tell a Huawei story, right? That's part of talking about backdoors in code. As far as I know, no one has come out and said, I found a backdoor in a Huawei product. I don't know that that's ever happened. Even though we worry about it. And so maybe that goes to say that it's really hard to find a backdoor, except if that backdoor is put in as a vulnerability intentionally. And there's certainly vulnerabilities in Huawei products. I was at Hack in the Box in Kuala Lumpur in 2012, sort of when it was a hot topic, like that, people were starting to use Huawei and we were afraid that there was backdoors there. And a gentleman named Felix Linder, who owned a very sophisticated vulnerability research company in Berlin, said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to spend some of my funding, and I'm just going to assess some of these Huawei routers. I'm going to reverse engineer them. I'm going to look at the code. I'm going to see if I can find any backdoors. And he did this for a few products and was going to release his results at this Hack in the Box in 2012. Well, you can imagine that Huawei was very interested in this presentation. And so they didn't come to the whole conference, but right before this presentation started, 5 gentlemen dressed in suits, which was a little bit strange for this particular conference, which is more of a DEF CON style conference, came and sat in the front row to watch Felix's presentation. And basically his presentation talked about how horrible Huawei designed their products and how many vulnerabilities he was able to find in the products. Command execution vulnerabilities, information leakage vulnerabilities, authorization bypass vulnerabilities in these different routers. He even found Cisco code in there that they had just ripped off and just tried to obfuscate a little bit. So this was kind of embarrassing for the Huawei executives, but he didn't find anything which was like a, quote, smoking gun that looked like a backdoor. They just looked like poorly secured code. And so I think it's almost impossible to find certain kinds of backdoors, but it's very possible to find the ones where the vulnerabilities are just planted in the code. So, SolarWinds obviously was a big kickoff for the impetus to create the cybersecurity executive order. And I want to talk about some of the parts of the executive order because I think it really is leading the way for how we can standardize some of the activity that Veracode does with its customers across the entire software ecosystem. And these are 3 examples of what we're seeing happen out there, like the Kaseya attack in July 2021, which is just about a year ago right now, was a 0-day vulnerability was found, and I believe it was the REvil ransomware group found this vulnerability, and it was just basically it was a coding mistake. They leaked a password. They had a way of downloading a sample agent that then leaked the password and they were able to use that password to get in the system and then act as an administrator, and they used that to push software updates. So they actually, any Kaseya customer, they were able to get the password for your systems and push down ransomware onto your system. So this was using a 0-day vulnerability to push ransomware. A second case I want to talk about is the UA parser.js. This is what I would call a naive backdoor. This could have been backdoored much, much easier. This is a very popular JavaScript library. It's downloaded 8 million times per week. That's how popular it is. So almost every JavaScript website is using this this library. And someone stole the credentials of one of the developers on the project team and used their credentials to go add some code. But they did something that was really easy to detect. They added it once it was installed on the system. It would go out and pull down either a crypto miner. If it was on a Linux system, if it was on a Windows system, it pulled down a password stealing program from a particular IP address. This was discovered in a few days. But of course, over that source of few days, they got a lot of passwords. I don't know how much crypto mining they got done. But that's all it takes sometimes, right? The people had to change all the passwords of the systems that had this installed afterwards. But if they had just put in a command execution vulnerability, they had just changed the code so that some data that you input into that program over the web would have executed a command on the system, I can tell you that wouldn't have been found for a much longer period of time because it would have just looked like a vulnerability. And it would have just looked like someone was exploiting a vulnerability. So I think that, I don't want to give lessons to people who are backdooring software, but that was not a good one. And we all know about the Log4j incident that happened, very, very widespread. The one thing I want to say about it, and one of the reasons it was so widespread, is because of the way a lot of open source libraries are used, people don't know they're actually running it. We call these implicit dependencies. So a developer will include an open source package and build their software with it, and that package in turn will include Log4j as that package's way of logging. And so the developer doesn't even think about Log4j. They don't think that, oh, I installed Log4j and I'm using Log4j for logging. They think I'm developing with the Spring framework and I'm using the Spring framework, and the Spring framework then pulls it in. So this is where it's really important to have an automated approach that can actually go and inspect all the software to find these libraries. And of course, that's one of the things the SBOM is there for. Another attack that attacked a supply chain that many people probably don't know about was Mandiant published this, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago. APT41 was found using a zero-day vulnerability in this USA HERDS application to attack farm data that was being collected by state governments. They have certain reporting requirements that HERDS need to be reported to these different state governments. They all use this one piece of software to do it. So APT41 found a vulnerability in that and was able to get all this farm data. So I guess this is a little bit what Edward Yu was talking about, is this proprietary data about farming in the US is important to attackers. They also used Log4j vulnerabilities to get at this data. And so one of the things, and because USA was in the title, the company is based in the USA. Of course, we scan software from all over the world. Is that, you know, even if it's a US company writing US software and you feel like it's a little bit more trusted, you got to realize that most of these companies are using open source, and the developers of that open source are completely global, and there's really no way to control that. And also, you know, companies use offshore developers. You know, they might be using them in India or Eastern Europe, but a lot of companies use offshore developers in China and Russia. So that should probably heighten the awareness of, you know, vulnerabilities posed as backdoors in first-party code. So really what I want to talk about in the last, you know, part of my talk is really how the executive order talks about managing these vulnerabilities and backdoors that are put into code, because they're totally there unless you do something about it. So, you know, the executive order I really liked because it really drew on like the last 10 to 15 years of what had been happening in pieces and pockets in where people really needed high assurance. So I'm sure, you know, the DoD and Intel community was doing this in places. You know, banks and, you know, manufacturers like Boeing were doing this. But in general, the rigor that was going into developing secure software that you could trust and trust your supplier just really wasn't there. And so I was very, very happy to see that I think 40% of the Biden cybersecurity executive order talked about supply chain and the supply chain of software. So it talked about the security of the development process, a lot about realizing the risk of open source, talked about that this had to be a public and private collaboration. You know, software vendors had to agree that these things were possible to do, and they could still, they were not cost prohibitive or time prohibitive. So that it really opened up that dialogue. I took part in a lot of workshops. You know, I could play the sort of the middleman between the vendor and the enterprise, because I've secured software for both sides of that equation. Realize that software is built with DevOps these days. It's a highly quick, iterative process. Software is basically streamed and continuous now, whether it's on the cloud, it's a mobile app, it's on your desktop. It's constantly being updated with new functionality and fixing bugs and patching, right? So it has to incorporate that highly automated process of DevOps. And this was actually mentioned yesterday in reference to Singapore's IoT labeling, but there's pilot programs from the Department of Commerce in there for IoT labeling, putting security labels on IoT and general purpose software, because they realize there is a little bit of a difference between the two. So, you know, 1 year in, this is sort of where we're at, right? NIST has defined a lot of these things, such as, what should a software acquirer ask of their software vendor? What artifacts? And one of the things they've come up with is, by default, it should be self-certification. The vendor should be able to just sort of self-certify. You should trust your vendor to be honest and open. I'll leave it to the user, leave it to the audience to say, well, which vendor should you trust to self-certify and not? And if you can't trust the vendor to self-certify, don't use their software or get a third-party certification, which is something Veracode can do. Another thing is they defined critical software. So we can't boil the ocean. We can't do this for every piece of software the U.S. government purchases. So they defined a threshold where the software had to be privileged. Something like the SolarWinds software, it had to have raw network access or privileged access on the system it's on, like an operating system would, or antivirus software would, or a virtual machine software would, some sort of privileged access on the system. I think that might be a good start, but I think we quickly have to open that up, because if you look at some of the major breaches out there, they're just from regular web apps. Like the Equifax breach was just a web app that was customer facing. The Target breach was a vendor management app that vendors use. Those wouldn't be defined as critical software, although those cost hundreds of millions of dollars in damage to those companies. So we have to figure out how to open up that aperture without including everything, all the software out there. So I think the one thing I'm going to end on is educate you a little bit about the Secure Software Development Framework, because I think this is really the core document that is putting this all together for what a acquirer of software should demand from their software vendor. And there was a Secure Software Development Framework 1.0 that NIST had developed, but over the last year they've come out with 1.1, and they've taken all the input that's happened over all these different workshops and industry input that has happened due to the executive order, and it basically codifies all the things that the executive order was trying to do. So there's really four parts of it that I want to talk about. One is prepare the organization, so define the tools, the tool chain, and educate developers. That's super important. And so that's something that you should be asking your software vendors. Have they done that phase? And the SSDF actually has a checklist that goes through these different items that a vendor can fill out and say, I am actually doing all of these things, and you can ask for evidence of that. Like, show me that your developers have had training. Importantly, it's protect the software from sort of cradle to grave at the vendor. So from the very inception of writing code or pulling down open source to building it in that pipeline, making sure that can't be tampered with by an attacker. So since backdoors are so difficult to find, really good backdoors, you have to protect that pipeline. We have to go by the assumption that a sophisticated attacker can put, if they have access to the artifacts or the code, can put a backdoor in there. So we have to protect against that and verify what we're releasing is what we think we're building. And then just embed security processes in that pipeline: static analysis, dynamic analysis, open source component testing that can generate an SBOM. So I think SBOM is great. It's a great start, but there's still a lot of problems with SBOM. We have these standards, Cyclone DX and SPDX, that vendors can generate but I think the big problem, and this is what I talk about here with this VEX development, is we need to actually understand if the vulnerability that's in an open source component creates a vulnerability in the application that component is being used by. When Heartbleed came out, which was in the OpenSSL library, if you were using OpenSSL to create SSL connections, you had a vulnerability. If you were using it just to create MD5 hashes or just to encrypt a file at rest, you didn't have the vulnerability, even though you were using the library. So we need to make a distinction whether there's actually the vulnerability is inherited by the application that uses it. And that's one of these things that vendors really don't like about SBOM, because they're going to put out 100 different components that they're using, and perhaps all of those components have vulnerabilities in them, and none of them actually affect that application. The last thing I want to say, because I'm running out of time, is we really need to understand how to manage these SBOMs. What are we going to do with them, right? Vendors are going to create them, but what is the customer going to do with them? How are they going to manage these SBOMs, and how are they going to manage understanding whether the list of open source actually means that there's a vulnerability in the application that they've installed on site and are using. And then just one final thing is the SSDF actually says you have to be able to respond to vulnerabilities. You have to have a process where you can find out about a vulnerability from a researcher or from the threat space changing, the vulnerability space changing, because there's a new known vulnerability in open source you're using. You have to have a process of quickly intaking new information, updating your software, and getting it out to your customer. So thank you with that. Appreciate the time, and hopefully that was good for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And before we bring up, I just want to very quickly thank Gavini, who is and has been a partner of the Government Business Executive Forum. They provide, our members know, those of you who are new to this conference, in Las Vegas, we always open. Gavini does an outstanding analysis. It's provided to attendees, hard copy only, very valuable and very sobering. Those of us that were in Las Vegas, it was a comparison between the United States and China on a number of fronts. And it was just a sobering but really interesting discussion that led one of the impetus behind this conference. And it's always powerful. And so you have the National Security Scorecard, and Tara Murphy-Dougherty is the Chief Executive Officer and President. And this panel, which is an appropriate conclusion to this conference, is one that she and Gavini put forward, and I just wanted to come up and thank them for the partnership and what you're going to see now. So let's go.
The EDGE22 co-chairs and GBEF team chose the next plenary executive roundtable as the close of this conference. The hope is that all attendees leave San Diego with a deeper appreciation of supply chain complexities, challenges, and their direct relationship to and impact on the security of IT systems, smart industrial control devices, UAVs, and the billions of IoT devices, all of which can create and exploit vulnerabilities. Gavini President and CEO Tara Murphy-Dougherty will moderate the roundtable. She has assembled an unmatched group of senior professionals, all of whom have direct responsibility over critical supply chain operations and policy considerations. Joining Tara are Robert Costello, Chief Information Officer, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency; Ben Myron, Vice President of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure, NextEra Energy, who also sits on the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee of Governor Ron DeSantis; Fred Runavar, Chief, Mission Assurance Division, Defense Information Systems Agency; Sudha Vyas, Chief Cyber Architect, Office of the Chief Information Officer, Department of Defense.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Don, for the introduction. Congratulations to you and Mary Shea and Laura and your amazing team on yet another phenomenal event. This one, an inaugural event as well, and I'm very honored to be here to wrap it up with this truly unmatched group of practitioners in the supply chain risk management space across the federal government. As Don mentioned, we do have, for the first time this year, our annual scorecard. Please take copies home for your colleagues, in addition for yourself. I feel like COVID set a lot of past traditions aside, but one, as a reminder, is you're supposed to bring the office a souvenir. So instead of buying chocolates at the airport, bring them something they can read. We at Gavini have had a long partnership with GBEF, and I really value the conversations that have happened in this space. We like to think that we use data to put the fear of God in you about what's happening in national security, but Edward, if you're still here, boy, did you do that today. Really interesting presentation. We're going to build on this supply chain risk management theme by talking today about how it is specific and unique within the space of information and communications technologies, how that impacts critical defense supply chains, critical homeland security supply chains, and the federal government overall, as well as the business practices of federal government. Thanks again to my panelists for joining. Really excited to hear from you. So let's get started. Bob, I'm going to put the first question to you. Yesterday, I think Steve Ryan put this perfectly in summing up the challenge and did so in an incredibly pithy way. He said, "We simply can't not know what's in our stuff anymore." And it's true. It has become a national imperative at this point to get our arms around the supply chain challenges we're facing. But this isn't a new challenge. Yes, COVID exposed fragility that we underestimated. Yes, globalization has propelled this. But what else is happening now that makes this such a pivotal issue?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, my role at CISA is different than different roles I've had at DHS over the last 14, 15 years or so. And I think one of the things that my kind of dual-headed role is, internally, I'm very concerned now with things that I wasn't maybe 20 years ago. I didn't suspect 20 years ago that maybe that router I got wasn't really from Cisco, or didn't have parts in it that maybe had been counterfeited or tampered with. And, that's something that, we are concerned with now, and certainly as well over at DHS. One of my prior roles at Customs and Border Protection, we just heard earlier on a lot of the issues with human rights and slave labor. And that's a big part of the role of the department, is verifying those supply chains to make sure that there is not slave labor in manufacturing. And that could be with information technology or, with the clothes that we wear. So these are very important things to us over at DHS. I think in my role now, it's different than I anticipated maybe when I took it 10 months ago. And for me, it's a retraining. The government was traditionally in some of the offices very just concerned with that paperwork security. Are we doing an ATO or are we buying the right stuff? Is it on the technical reference model? And not going very deep into it. And I think now we're asking our partners to go a lot deeper into their suppliers. We're asking to verify that a lot more. I know we're going to talk about self-attestation and what goes into that. Should we accept it? Should we not? I really don't have a great answer on that. But I think what's really changed for me is I think we have to be a lot more careful. We have to train people a lot earlier. I have a lot of new developers that are doing really great work, but they don't see anything wrong pulling code from all over the world. Right. And we have to provide the right tools, at least on my side, to help verify that and scan it. And I think one of the other things that we're trying to work on as well, and this is something, I remember back to my military days, I was always getting a lot of training. We're not always training on the civilian side to that level. Like, we don't discuss these issues enough. So we're not training developers or IT professionals to be looking for these things, what they should be looking for. I think it's great, all these standards that are out there. If you were to ask my team or the DHS headquarters team, it's a very small team of people doing this at DHS. And oftentimes it's too small, it's not automated enough, there's not a lot of partnership with industry to the level that it needs to be. And I think those are things that we need to work on. And I think that's what kind of changed for us. We can look at SolarWinds, and there was a lot that went into SolarWinds. It wasn't just that SolarWinds had a problem. We had problems across our configuration space on how we were doing things that allowed that event to essentially move lateral across so many different spaces. But I think for me, what I'm really concentrating on is training people, awareness, and then for those of us in government roles, it's very important that we're advocating through the budget cycle for the amount of money that we need to do these things. I talked about it at another panel how most of my budget goes to just keeping the lights on. And that's really difficult when you need to expand your workforce to do new work. That's absolutely critical, because we are doing still quite a bit of custom development internally, so I often have the same problems as any OEM out there as well.
Fantastic answer. You hit on so many things that I want this panel to come back to. And one that I hadn't thought to address at the outset, but is so incredibly important, which is the training and education piece of the workforce. And there are workforce challenges across the entire industrial base supporting all of our federal activities. The gap in training in this area is so acute for exactly what you said. we go into so many different offices on the Govini side, and we sit down with these users who say, okay, I've got a mandate from leadership. I need to investigate risk in the supply chain. I need to figure out, are there Chinese parts in this weapon system? Are there Chinese suppliers in this IT system? But what is supply chain risk management? That's where the conversation begins. And we actually have put together a certification program that is a 1-week training course for anyone who's interested in the national security workforce, not just our government users, for this very reason, and to fill this gap. And I suspect we won't be the only ones to do so, but I'm very excited to see that take off this year. Suda, if you're mic'd up, and I could, I wanted to turn to you and actually pick up on some of what Bob was referring to. You know, the ATO focus and what we have learned over the past 15 years in cybersecurity has been phenomenal. And so how do we take some of the lessons, or what do you see within the cybersecurity realm that is either working or has been done well that might inform some of the approaches that we need in ICT, supply chain risk management?
Yeah, so great question. And on behalf of, I guess, all the panelists, I really appreciate being invited to the summit, and especially to this panel. So I think you hit a lot of the key topics, I think, there. So one of the biggest ones is, I'd say the threefold, is our laws, right? So one of the things that we've found out, especially as, I'm going to say the buzzword, the zero trust side, is the biggest concern I do have is how do you make sure that it enables, you know, because we always go back to authorities and to what laws and policies we have on there. And so that's one of the things we're looking at from a supply chain risk management. The other thing that he'd mentioned is partnerships. And within DoD, I think it's like over 1,100 different companies, right? They range from the big ones, the 10,000 plus employees, to the 250 employees. Our focus is really, of course, across the board, but definitely the 250 plus employees, because they're asking for help. And so two of the areas that we've kind of, the biggest lessons learned, what I saw a shift in is before it was, you know, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z, right, from DoD? And now it's more of a partnership where it's, hey, we have these tools, we're here to help you. And so we have the DoD CIO DIB, the Defense Industrial Base partnership, which has over 1,000 team members on there representing about close to 500 different companies. But the main gist of that is the transparency of information. And what we've seen, at least what I've seen I've been with the DoD CIO for the last year and a half, is an increase of the company self-reporting. And when they self-report, they say, hey, this is what happened, how can you help? And then the second one is NSA standing up their Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. That's immense. And I would, if you haven't done so, I'd highly recommend you to reach out to them, because they not only provide support, but they provide the tools. And they've learned too, NSA is also, it's a partnership, so they've also learned from industry where you have some of the developers identifying ways to catch and identify different vulnerabilities. And so that's one area. And you mentioned the ATO. We're moving towards it focusing on the R, the risk, right? It's been very compliance-based, it's paper-based. And so that's the whole continuous monitoring, which kind of ties into the zero trust strategy. We cannot be in a reactive mode. Again, I appreciate all the briefs that came before, because it kind of set this discussion here.
Definitely.
But that's one. I think the other thing too, it's SCRIM by far, at least I'm dating myself, one of the first things I did is perimeter protection. And perimeter protection, you look at the bomb, whether it's software or hardware. And the problem there back in the day was that it just took so long to get the reports back from the threat community. By the time we got it back, we're already milestone C, right? The things are being delivered. We already have our prototypes out. And then a decision's gonna be made. What's the risk of making sure that our warfighters have this capability versus the risk of a compromise? And so what we're seeing right now, it's actually a holistic view. And I believe some of the team members before mentioned it, where we can't look at these as stovepipe. It's how does it all fit together? How do we make sure we have an informed decision? And again, for supply chain, the biggest concern for me is we're all on board with zero trust. It's data. The data is a heartbeat. What are the unintended consequences, and how do we kind of jump ahead of that to make sure that we're not only, from a DoD perspective, we're not putting in just the requirements, we're putting it from a contractual perspective, but how are we making sure it's done through a partnership? And I'll extend it also to our mission partners, because we don't just work in a void, right? We're working, when a mission hits, we're seeing it right now on the Ukrainian side, is what do we need to do in order to make sure a mission is met? And then also from a veteran perspective is we have a bunch of our veterans that also rely on services. So how do we make sure that supply chain is intact?
Great points. Okay, Fred, over to you. From your perspective, as you look at information systems for the Department of Defense, how do you think about making trade-offs in order to execute against a supply chain risk management strategy? You know, one of the most traditional views in defense program land is, of course, the classic iron triangle: cost, schedule, performance. Any good engineer will tell you, you can get 2, but you can never get 3. There is, it seems, as we are on the other side of this highly globalized world, the exogenous threats we've seen, or events like COVID, there's a new iron triangle within SCRIM in particular. But the trade-offs are now among efficiency, resiliency, and dominance. And in some cases, we certainly want to focus on resiliency, or in some cases, we might want that dominance, and there are entire supply chains that the United States just needs to own, or we need to reshore. But then there might still very much be places where we're willing to accept risk in those regards and drive efficiency. That's a really tough set of trade-offs. How do you think through that in your space?
So if you know anything about mythology, right, so you got Pandora's box and you open the lid and everything goes out, but hope remains under the lid. I think there's times that I don't even think hope is there, right, from my perspective. So DIS is the big bandwidth telecom provider for DoD. Every place we are, from Afghanistan to Southeast Asia, we provide that connectivity. We don't own it. We don't operate it. We rely upon it. So as we look at the missions that DoD has across the full spectrum of operations, there's some that are at the top. Frederick the Great once said, those who protect everything protect nothing. So you got to get back down to that. What is the most important thing that always has to be on, always has to be available? For DISA, capacity and diversity equals survivability, but there's certain things that you need to make sure that your PACE plan, your primary and alternate communication, is always available. You can't have a nuclear capability that doesn't have command and control or doesn't have the right level of efficiency. So as you look across that, the trade-offs really get back down to the things you can't have a trade-off and things that have to be always on and always operating. National security systems, as defined, are those critical systems, and there's covered systems within those systems that we have to make sure that are on and available. So working directly within DoD and with, I'm a retired Air Force guy, not a Navy guy, but the 3-ship principle: partnership, friendship, relationships. Get back down to that, looking at what we are using, where we're using it, what's most critical, and then those systems and subsystems have to be available. The tools that we're using, your tool is one of them, right, will help us go out and will give us that information: who owns the company, operates the company, where are the foci concerns. And so as you strategize that, then you take a look at those things that have to be available, and that's where you can't take risk. If it's developed and manufactured in China and there's a tie back to the PRC, you got to say, hey, this is something we can't put on the network. The challenge you have, if you read the book, the Kill Chain, they talk about the acquisition process and why DoD is broken. And you hit on it, right? So by the time we get to the point to say we're going to buy it, we've tested it, there's a clear supply chain, it's already operating here in the field, or we're 5 or 10 years behind the strategy. But ICT doesn't work that way. There's 136,000 companies that are in the ICT business today. 43% of them have direct ties to China. And oh, by the way, that's everything from routers to switches to servers to firewalls to software-driven platforms, software-defined networking, and it's very difficult. So again, you have to synergize that capability and what you have to have available. We prioritize that and say, okay, we're not going to look at everything today, but that has to be on for a national security system. And that's where we start making our risk decisions and making sure that we're not compromised.
Those numbers are staggering, so the Pandora's box reference makes a lot of help. It makes a lot of sense. Ben, I'm curious, from your perspective on the industry side, there must be places where industry can help. What do you think some of the areas that industry should be screaming from the top of its lungs, this is either where we are on the commercial sector and government, you need to adopt this, or we know we can help in this area, let us in and do it. We heard comments yesterday in the panels about, yes, talk to these companies earlier, right? It'll save you time doing your splaining on the back end. What do you think some of those areas are?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tara. And as I guess the voice of the private sector here today on the panel, I think there is a lot of partnership that needs to happen across the board. And I see, the industry side not wanting to get too far out in front of our skis and trying to match and align timelines with government and kind of where all those things land, because this is a space that I do think needs to be sort of lockstep as we move forward. And the challenge with that obviously is you tend to go a little slower when you're trying to get everybody together and on the same page. And I think that's a bit where we're going. The great thing that I see right now is we've got a lot of steam. And so I think, sort of three areas where I think, government continues to help and partner and facilitate the work with the private sector and industries. And so the first one I think is that top level, governance around, hey, what should we be doing? How should we be thinking about software and supply chain risk management? And how do you help set and facilitate the groups where we're getting people together? I think one of the things we've struggled with in the past is how do we get our suppliers on board, right? So I'm an asset owner. How do we coordinate with our supplier base, get them on the same page? And then that has to work with some level of oversight, compliance. And I think government teams, DHS and CISA, we work closely with. And I think there's been a lot of progress in trying to facilitate those discussions. I think that needs to keep happening, and frankly, it probably needs to speed up for us to address the problem. I think the second thing that we continue to look for more support and progress is how do we get some level of independence outside of just our teams working together? And so I don't know if government can necessarily do that, but again, I think that helping to stand up independent review boards. We've seen a lot of progress and work in the aviation sector. We've talked about transportation, obviously. I think that needs to go broader and really focused on more of the technology and communications space as a whole, as a horizontal, versus maybe being in some of those verticals. And I think, again, a collaborative forum for us to drive some of those things I think is really important. And then I think there's a lot of innovation, the third piece. We talk a lot about everything is sourced out of different countries. What do we do to incite and drive innovation within the U.S. for some of these things that are really critical path for us? How are we building that pipeline of things that we can drive and build within the country that we can help get ahead of and understand really soup to nuts? How does it get built? Where's the software coming from? What are all the components? And yes, some of these other things we're working like SBOM are going to help drive that from a reactive standpoint. But if we don't set those wheels in motion now, I think we're going to be continuing to be reactive and falling behind, frankly.
You said a few things in there that I think are exactly the right next topic. One is partnership in this theme. Public, partner, private, public, partnership and collaboration.
3Ps.
Has to be, yes. If you can articulate it, then, that's half the battle. So how do we get after it? Because there's clear consensus that this is going to be so important to driving change. And as we heard in the previous presentation, SBOMs are an emerging topic or area, an approach where this issue of collaboration between government and the private sector is going to be on display or come to a head. So I'd love to hear from both Bob, you, and Sudha on where things stand with SBOM initiatives on the government side. Do you think the government's ready for implementation? I have to agree with our previous speaker. I worry deeply there will be a moment of, great, we got SBOMs, now what?
Sure, I'll go first. Hopefully the mic is working this time. Luckily I have a loud voice. Well, I think we heard a couple things, and CISA is doing something similar to NSA. We have the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. that I think has proven quite valuable, particularly starting in December with Log 4, and then starting earlier this year with Ukraine. And that's been really effective to allow us to share information very rapidly with our private sector partners in a secure manner. I think on SBOMs, you bring up a good point. I think we're still, sometimes I can even walk the halls of CISA and hear, 12 different explanations of what SBOMs are going to get us. And then, we all, well, not me, those that have worked with me know I don't like meetings. But, I'll hear someone say, well, let's have a big meeting and a big thing on it. I think it'll help. I think it's an incremental step. I think it's important that we know what's in the software that we're either purchasing or that we're developing ourselves. I think the government needs to hold itself to the same standard as others. I do have concerns that maybe I'm hearing things like I heard 3 to 4 years ago, Zero Trust is going to solve all our cybersecurity problems, and all these, or I always make the joke that for 25 years I've heard that, one product's going to give me a single pane of glass of all my networks and applications running, and that just doesn't happen. I think on our side, I think you're seeing a lot more communication from us on what CISA expects from SBOMs. I think I'd be interested to hear Sudha's thoughts as well, because one of the concerns that we're getting back is you're not putting it in your contracts, or it's not clear what you want us to deliver, and that's something that we have to really. It's been something I've been working on for a long time, even before I got to CISA, is the government needs to do good contracting, because it is a partnership, and if the contract doesn't lay out what's in there or the expectations, then we really can't hold the vendor accountable for what we want. So I'm really seeing some good positive movement at DHS through that. We're doing a lot more industry engagement than CISA has in the past. Once a month we have an industry engagement event, so you can hear the problems that we're trying to solve. I think all of that will go into it. I think on the SBOM front, I'm not sure if we're ready. I know, like, my team, probably not. I think it would be helpful. I think one of the areas we struggle with, we'll go back to Log 4. That was a big struggle, I think, for everyone. It was widely used. We were often pinging vendors, is it in there, and waiting weeks for a response. I don't know that an SBOM would have solved that, because I don't know that we have all the systems in place to consume it and parse it and know where it all is. I think it's getting better, but I think it's kind of like Zero Trust. We're going to be talking about it for a while, and it is going to help, but it's not an overnight thing.
Right. Sudha.
Yeah, so I was trying not to get too depressed. I typically try to say, there's always like
there's hope.
Or as he's like crush the hope. But I think one of the biggest thing is when we talk about SBOMs or just bombs in general, they've been around, or the requirement's been there. It's just a matter of doing it. And I think what's kind of evolved, right, is before it was like a check. Okay, we gave the bill of materials. And then maybe to the point that the previous gentleman had mentioned is like, now what do you do with that information, right? And then it's a little bit reactive. And so what I see an opportunity here is, one, there's a little bit, I don't say a little bit, there's a little bit more energy in regards to leveraging the current requirements we have and really exercising the authorities, but in a collaborative way. And I know Ben had mentioned the partnership. I'd say it has to be partnership on steroids right now. We talk about meeting up with industry and figuring out ways that, one, to pull in and make sure that our skill force right here in the States is like adapt or getting a little bit more advanced. But that's one of the things that I've noticed too, is the last maybe year and a half, is that collaboration on steroids with industry, and then of course we'll see with our other international partners. Having said that, I think there is a lot of work, and that goes back to the leveraging AI. We can't continuously get the spreadsheets and try to decipher them and figure out. It just takes too long. And if we want to meet that nirvana of zero trust, we definitely are going to have to find a way to be more innovative. And that's where industry plays a role. That's where that partnership plays a role. Without that, we could continue as a status quo is not an option now. So the SBOM definitely, there's a hardware, but the other thing too, it's all about that data, right? And that's what I loved about another aspect from Edward Yu's thing is that there's similarities. So when I think about the SBOM, the parallelism is like the list of food ingredients, right, on a package. We could either opt to say, oh, we don't want to look at that food ingredients to know like which ones are kind of detrimental to our health and which ones, we just opt to like bypass it because we figure the risk is nominal. But I think that's where we really need to get to is understanding what, from that SBOM, what information do we need? And then also to Fred's point, we can't do it all. So how do we make sure that we understand what's in our network so we can then make the right decisions about which ones do we want to assume risk, which ones do we really need to focus our attention on?
Yeah. The collaboration on steroids point is a good one and goes hand in hand with the point that you made, Bob, on contracting, because as any decent manager knows, if you want agreement on something, put it in writing. And so I think there's an appetite from the industry side as well to have clarity on those expectations. And certainly from a data perspective, that data is valuable and isn't lost on industry. So you either get it written into a contract at the outset, and you're not having debates about technical data packages and ownership around data rights later on, or you end up having to solve it on the back end. Ben, from an industry perspective, what do you think incentivizes vendors in this space to buy into collaboration on steroids and their view of the SBOM dynamic?
Well, I think the first thing is everybody's starting to ask for SBOMs. And so whether that's contractually or part of review processes and things like that, but I think as this picks up, the more that everyone universally is starting to say, hey, this is a core requirement that we have in order to get comfortable with whatever it is that we're purchasing. I think as organizations start to do that, I think we'll start to see a big change and a lot faster change. And then I think on the back end of that, I think there's a lot of value of what's in it for me as a provider of a product on why it is something that I should be investing in and creating. And I think if we can, back to getting away from spreadsheets, I think the more that we can push the automation in a secure way to be able to then collect some of that information around the bill of materials, I think that's going to really help us understand the value on both sides. And so, like for us, we're already thinking about, okay, we're going to be able to search things and the usability in response to, understanding where there is a vulnerability that's come out, and having some of those capabilities is really important. But there's a lot of work that goes into that to be able to construct and build the automation, because it can't be, we're pushing paper around. It has to be a more universal system. And the only other thing I say is I've been doing this for a little while, and we have all these great ideas, and I've seen this a couple of times, and then we build it, and then we're like, wow, that's a really scary thing that we just built, and then we go and take it away because we built something that is, actually, potentially used for bad. And I worry a little bit about this space too, and just, piggybacking on Ed's talk earlier, we're going to have a whole lot of data that really maps the way all this stuff works, and if we're not careful, that can be really a bad thing as well.
Absolutely. Fred, from your perspective, so much experience in this space, you've seen people do this right, people do it poorly, where the gaps are. Give us some of that hope. Are there any bright spots from a best practices perspective? In the context of SBOMs, we don't have to start from scratch. It really, truly is a data problem, and the data exists. It's all in whether you're capable of connecting it. Are there other, even stepping back from SBOMs and looking at ICT, supply chain risk management more broadly, do you think there are bright spots or best practices that we can leverage as a starting point?
If you look at how we did supply chain risk management in DISA 4 years ago, something to be really concerning, whether it was a hack or whether it was a failure of a component. So then I had some of my folks, it was very small, I had a team of 3 people for all that comm around the world. And they'd get on the internet and they'd start Googling and searching, right? So now the tools that we use actually sweep the internet, right? So they use this artificial intelligence, and they do the acquisition of information and give us that, no kidding, Bob is really Chen, and Chen is really in Shanghai, and he's really tied to PRC and all the financing. So, it gives us that next level of analytics. So I'm really happy about that. But as you and I talked about yesterday, if I have a fork and a knife and that fork is bad, we know it's bad, if I can never get left of acquisition, I can never change the dynamic of where we're at today. I think we're close. I think within the community, we are finding things in supply chain to include software, right? We're close to say that's bad, we shouldn't use it. And then other folks that work in this business are saying, yeah, and this is what they're really doing. We start nailing that down, all of a sudden we start nailing down supply chains that we shouldn't be utilizing today. The National Defense Acquisition Act of 2019 and that Section 889 that calls out several companies was a huge step forward in the business that I'm in. I can all day long go to a camp post station. I've been so many places across this globe, especially when I did my time in the Middle East, and walk into a network operations center on a U.S. military installation and saw Huawei equipment there and say, oh my God, it shouldn't be there. Moreover, walk into one someplace else in Europe and see the same equipment, and normally when whatever telecom vendor buys equipment, it'll be shipped to a central staging place, then they send it out to where they're installing it. When you see stuff coming from China directly to a U.S. military installation, you're like, wait a minute. And oh, by the way, that's Huawei. Didn't say the name. That's a product that we shouldn't be using. Sure. That's scary, but we're moving past that, and that's the good thing within the Department of Defense. We are actually getting to the point when intelligence services and our guys that are doing the supply chain analysis are teaming together on it, right? We're working directly with CISA on some of the alerts and advisories you're putting out, things that we may have overlooked. Again, that's that partnership. Industry is stepping forward and saying, hey, this is where we're going to go in the future with driven networking, right? And this is who we're partnering with. Then when we do our research, we can go back and say, we're not so comfortable with that. You want a contract, but the whole key is getting the front side of that contract to say, nope, they might be the cheapest, might be fastest to service, but there's a lot of risks we shouldn't take. We have some challenges with not putting stuff on contract, but we can at least get to the point where we say we're not going to put it on network, right? NSS systems always have to be on, always have to be available, right? Can't stop people from buying it. We say you're not going to put it on network, so why buy it, right? There's a whole bunch of legal framework with the Federal Acquisition Regulation and how we do stuff. So that's the good news story, right? We have a program now where we've put together over 500 due diligence analysis reports, and now we can say of those, X number are good, X number are kind of not good, and these ones are horrible, right? That foci concern that we're tying that down to is giving us change management within DISA and the department. And, oh, by the way, we're sharing that with the Navy, with the Army, with the Air Force, with the combatant commands. And they're doing the same with us. So now it's not just us running these reports, we're working on the same format, using the same tools, getting the same information from industry and CISA. So now it's a teaming effort. That didn't exist 4 years ago. The tools that we're using, we weren't using 4 years ago. So there's your hope inside of Pandora's box.
That is a flicker. In fact, I was afraid to ask the information sharing question lest we lose the flicker and it goes out entirely, but that's really good to hear. And the progress is one thing, but when progress starts being redone the same way in a subscale fragmented approach, you just don't get the leverage that you need from tackling something at scale. So that's very exciting. In the midst of all of this is CISA. We've heard collaboration with CISA brought up over and over the course of the past few days. So can you make that flicker a little stronger, Bob? You see any bright spots?
I see a lot of bright spots, and it has been pretty fun to be out here and hear CISA's name mentioned so often. And I think we are doing a lot of really good work in a lot of different spaces, and even at a lot, you bring up a lot of good points about where we maybe experiencing technology we shouldn't. One of the roles of CISA as well, which a lot of people don't know, we inherited a lot of missions when were created is we work a lot with the telecom companies. Day in and day out, we have a whole division that's dedicated to working with the telecoms, particularly on emergency communications, but on issues like 5G and a bunch of other really critical issues that touch every American's lives. And one of the areas that there was a good New York Times article on it and elsewhere, a lot of the rural carriers are really struggling with not purchasing Huawei because they simply can't afford the recommended products, we should say, or from the recommended companies. And I think that's something that we're concentrating on is working with them. I think our partnership with DoD is really getting a lot stronger, as well as with the intelligence community. The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, is really starting to kick off. We're seeing a lot more companies join. And then particularly through our vulnerability management program, where we provide scanning services to either critical infrastructure or state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. We are signing up over this year over 10,000 new subscribers to CISA services to work with us, share information, allow us to provide services to them that maybe they can't themselves. I think we often do not pay enough attention to the state and local governments that don't have the resources of the federal government to protect their networks, and they are absolutely a vector for nation states. You can get often the same type of personal information about American citizens from those as, we still talk about the OPM breach years ago. So I think there is a huge glimmer of hope for the work that CISA is doing, as well as the overall department. We heard a lot yesterday on what TSA is doing for the areas where they are the sector risk management agency that has a lot of, I wouldn't say overlap, but a lot of partnership with CISA. And I'm seeing that that's getting better, as well as our work with CBP and others. So I'm really starting to see every day increased collaboration. I'm getting lots of feedback from our customers that I support that they need better collaboration tools. So that must mean something. But I think there is more than a glimmer of hope. I think that the recent legislation, I would definitely encourage people. One of the areas where I always hear concern is, well, we didn't know it was happening. We'll participate in the rulemaking process. It's not fun, but it is open to the public and to private industry. And I really do. CISA wants input from our constituents, and we want to work with people.
Great. Sudha, I think if we had additional defense leaders here, one of the things at the DoD level that they would say is a bright spot is the establishment of the new Chief Digital and AI Officer. Yes. And I am optimistic about much, and what has me thinking about this is I think some of CISA's successes are its focus. And focus is important. And establishing a CDAO that reports to the Deputy Secretary of Defense prioritizes this mission. I would argue there still is no AI strategy for DoD. In things like AI that underpin what we've talked about today, the adoption of data in the Department for Security and other aspects, do you think there's a strategy in place?
Yes, I do. So we had the data strategy that came out about maybe a year ago. Signed off by Ms. Hicks, by the DSD. And so what you see the establishment for the CDAO was a strategic way of combining the DDS, the Defense Digital Service, which their pure mission is to take very complex challenges and resolve them. So the beauty about this is now you're partnering, you have DDS, you have AI, and then you have, which was JAIC, right? You had the Joint AI Center. And so you have the AI group, and then now you have the digital folks. Combining together, what we're seeing is, and this is maybe typically you have policy or memos ahead. This is where we're seeing actually results coming before all of that. And that's where a lot of the efforts that we're seeing in different parts of the world are resulting in some of the successes. And so that's, I think, when we talk about a strategy, one of the things we're also working with on the CDAO side is, again, there's elements within your favorite zero trust that has, for us, from a zero trust strategy perspective, AI is important. We cannot attain that. And again, it's a strategy, right? But it's how do we attain that nirvana or the concept of zero trust without AI? It's unfeasible. So when we're moving towards this AI strategy, it's a notion of moving away from this, I keep on saying status, but the stovepipe notion, right? We're just doing AI, don't talk to us. It's more about pulling in the right team members. And I believe Edward Yu was pretty good in stating this towards the end. The notion of cybersecurity just being focused alone is gone, right? You have to pull in the legal aspects, you have to pull in the contractual, you have to pull in the IT, the enterprise folks. And so that's where we're seeing at least the benefits and the at least acceleration in some of the efforts from CDAO folks. So the other thing too is, given where we are from a political standpoint, is accelerating some of those key efforts or initiatives that they're putting out right now. And that wouldn't be the case if it's layered a little bit below more layers of bureaucracy. So when it comes to strategy is going to evolve. Sure. But what I'm seeing right now, the difference is that we're even for the zero trust strategy, it's going to be published for us, but we're going out right now and we're executing. And so I think that's another difference in the evolution, how we're looking across the board in a holistic way from a cybersecurity perspective.
And any strategy is only as good as its execution.
At that point, yeah.
So let's come back to the people aspect of this, because that plays such an important role in strategy execution. Fred, do you think we have the workforce to do this right and solve this mission today?
No. Flat out, no. And here's the challenge. So, I put a uniform on in 1973. I enlisted in the Air Force in 1977. 1979, 78, I had a conversation with one of the individuals I worked with. He talked about the end of the world is coming. We were at 4.3 billion people on the planet. We're at 7-point-something billion people on the planet. Technology has driven that changing dynamic and where we were in 1980 to where we're at today. The evolution of capabilities that we're utilizing has driven that dynamic. But technology has changed so fast that it's hard to keep up with it. Believe it or not, when we used to work at JTF Juno, I was the guy that did the subnet masking for the folks going into Iraq, and building the network that we didn't have enough bandwidth to make sure we could fight that war. Well, that's ancient architecture the way that it sits today, just, 15, 20 years later. So what I see is every time we get within DoD the right people and they're trained, out the door to industry they go. Yeah. And why would you stay in the Air Force or the Navy, as an E5, E6, when they offer you a $100,000 signing bonus and a $200,000 salary? So the challenge that we have is, how do you continually evolve the entire workforce to get us to where we're at? In supply chain, it's the same thing. The tools and the mechanisms that my folks are using today, we didn't have 4 or 5 years ago. So, and oh, by the way, I just had a changeover of the staff of 6 I had. 3 of them left for other jobs, right? Well, I can't pay my contractors more. I can't even hire them. So the reality of it is, there is a huge demand space for people that are trained. Again, it has to get back to, we as a community need to be continually looking at how to build this training to where a lot of people have some of the training. It's cost effective is the other portion of it. Because I will tell you, from my perspective as a 60-something-year-old leader, it scares me how smart these individuals are, but it scares me even more when they walk out the door and I got to start from zero again with folks that are not necessarily where this individual was when they left. So no, we don't have the skill set. Talk about industrial control systems, right? The people that do the cyber resiliency and the cyber portion of that game, we do not, within the United States government, within industry, within DoD, have the right amount of trained people that can do it. So no, we don't.
Fred was staring at me through that. Like, I could feel him saying.
That's okay, Ben. I want you to pile on and
look,
share what you think. Is this a national problem? Is it no, it's here. We've just got to figure out how to get these people excited about public service again.
Well, I can tell you, I do not have the skill sets myself to tackle that. So, no, look, I think from a workforce perspective, it's something I'm actually pretty passionate about, because I think it is going to be the thing that changes how we view the space, and not just supply chain, but the whole gamut of even what we've been talking about around cyber and security, the whole conference. I think we need to get changes made in the way that we are educating our folks. And when I think about a lot of the conversation that even we've been having is, and it came up even with 5G, right? We just designed and built this brand new 5G next gen awesomeness system, and in the security communities, everybody's worried about it. There's a whole bunch of security concerns. Well, what was the gap? Where were the engineers at when we were designing and thinking about security for even 5G to say, hey, we actually need to think about some of these different things. It's going to be used broadly. How are we going to do forensics? How are we going to be doing some of the resiliency components we keep talking about? Some of that's in, and it's a lot better. But the gap is, in my opinion, the separation between how we think about security and how we think about engineering and technologists. And those things need to come together. And to do that, I think we need to educate in high school. I think we need to educate in universities and colleges. And instead of an engineer coming out, and I was an engineer, I didn't take any security classes in my engineering curriculum, and it's not in the engineering curriculum today. And so why isn't that? Why aren't we thinking about security with ethics and the other core curriculums that are happening in the university system? I think we need to go back, we need to change that. And I think if we do that, we're going to start getting those folks going into the Northrop Grummons and the GEs and the Siemens, and start actually redesigning the way we deliver those products and the software side of things in a way that is going to hopefully change this for the future. But that's a long slog. That's a complexity that's going to take us a while, to work through the system. And so that's the short-term piece, and then there's, I think the longer play on our workforce. And the short-term is, I think we need to start really holding product and supply companies to a higher level standard, and really start hitting as a driving force or forcing function to say, hey, that's not acceptable anymore. And that's a hard conversation, because there's a lot, certainly, in the private sector, you've got business outcomes you've got to drive, you've got things you've got committed, but until we can, unfortunately, maybe delay that procurement process a little bit, and not sacrifice the security components for, the outcomes that we want to deliver with the products we're getting. So a couple quick thoughts there.
Absolutely.
That education, in my opinion, needs to start in middle school, way before college. We also were looking wrong at recruitment. We look a lot at this young boy and that young gentleman, and really there's 50% of our workforce, 53% I think in America, is being overlooked. The women, in technology is a strong driving factor, and this is a job everybody can do, right? There's no jobs that everybody can't do, but this is one we need everybody doing. So that's the changing dynamic of the environment that we live in the United States, and where we need to drive this into the future to change where we're at today and where we're going in the future.
Well, I like that message so much. I think we should wrap there. Bob, Suda, Fred, Ben, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. You truly are at the top of your fields in this space, so I hope that you all enjoyed the panel and learned something. Thanks.
All for being here for this event. As you know, this was our inaugural cybersecurity summit. It really is, it stands beside our EDGE at CES, which many of you have been to out in Vegas. So just as you know, when you try something like this, you don't know how it's going to go. There are a lot of uncertainties, and we feel like mission accomplished. We feel like we did what we needed to do. And of course, we want to thank all of our GBEF members that are here as well.
And a lot of the things we did are special, and we can't do them without our sponsors. And we really want to thank Carousel, Mike and Brian, you're here, Capgemini, Sean, Dan, Karen, Veritas, Carolyn, Brian, or Barry, what am I saying? GDIT, Tom, Adam, thank you, Dominion, and Glenn, and Jack, thank you, New Relic, we appreciate that.
Yeah, and we want to recognize our team. Without our team here at GBF, we couldn't do this. Mary Shea is in the back. Could you stand up? Let's give a round of applause for Mary Shea. Laura, if you could stand up, please. Thank you. Maureen is in the back as well. Maureen Dent, Mike's wife. Sarah Louise in the back. Thank you. Glenn, all those great posts and pictures. Is Glenn here? Right here in front. Thank you, Glenn. And then we have Adam's son, Finn. Where is Finn? In the back. Thank you. You know how much the GBF appreciates what all of you have done with this, the team. And on behalf of all of us, thank you again for a job well done.
I guess co-sponsors, right?
Yep.
I might do these co-chairs. I do the co-chairs.
Yeah. And of course, we have to thank our co-chairs. If you guys could come on up. Come on up.
Please give them a hand. They were invaluable.
Yeah. Adam, Sean, Brian, thank you.
Really, we were on the phone with them. All I would do is when I'd call him, especially Adam, because he's Dominion, I'd say, Adam, I want you to get this done, but please don't screw up the air conditioning in my house.
Yeah. And we do have a gift for you guys. If you remember, we took the picture behind the plane with Skunk. You're each going to get an individual framed picture of that.
Coming, but obviously it's a little early. But thank you all.
Yeah. You're very welcome. Thanks,
really
Brian.
great job.
Really appreciate it, man. You did a great job. Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you, sir, for making time to do this. Really appreciate it.
And there's one more group that we didn't thank, and I have to tell you, we have the best audio video team, I think, in the country. We travel with them. We don't outsource our AV stuff to anyone else. They came out, they drove the trailer, truck, semi, they built the stage, they do things on the fly. Sarah works with them, and so special thanks, Cyril, Anthony, Jared, Mike, Josue. Please stand up, you guys are awesome. We asked them to do one more thing, and let's see if they did it. We'll see you in Las Vegas. There we go, EDGE23. Well, we missed the Las Vegas. But anyway, in January, every attendee at this conference, we do sell that. We sell out EDGE23 at CES.
Done. You got it.
There it is. All right, good. All right. And you will receive, this year, GBF members, attendees of this summit will receive your own non-transferable link that allows you to register for Las Vegas in January at CES. And we will hope to see you there and back here for the second security summit. And we hope to have this team back with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Well done, my man. Well done.